The Roman municipality of Coimbriga has been attracting the interest of archaeologists since the 19th century. Only 20% of the city has so far been excavated. Many mysteries still remain undiscovered, but the ruins already revealed convey an atmosphere of antiquity and faded grandeur. The artifacts and artwork tell a poignant tale of the rise and fall of a once vibrant community, and these are now displayed in the modern museum building. Among these exhibits is the portrait of a local cavalryman, which gives context to some of the items unearthed in the old Roman city. The first time I saw this display, I felt a sudden doubt. Somehow, there seemed to be something wrong with the image. Eventually, I realised what had been troubling me. The horseman is clearly portrayed using stirrups, but such technology was unknown in Europe during the Classical Age. I was tempted to ask the museum staff for an explanation, because this is not a minor point or simple historical pedanticism. The arrival of the stirrup in Europe proved to be a watershed event and is considered by many historians to have ushered in the medieval period. This new invention provided a horseman with greater stability and significantly increased the importance of cavalry on the battlefield. This in turn led to the rise of that most recognisable of medieval figures, the armoured knight. Or at least, so the story goes. Of course, there was cavalry in the classical world. The ancient Greeks had a strong tradition of horsemanship, as did the Etruscans and the Romans. Their mounts were fleet and nimble, but relatively small. For this reason, cavalry was used primarily for reconnaissance or hit-and-run actions. Their numbers were also quite limited, since a horse was a luxury item, equivalent to a modern sports car. Few could afford them, so they were seldom the decisive component of an army. Battles were instead decided by heavy infantry, such as the hoplites of ancient Greece. These armoured soldiers were trained to fight in close formation. As long as they could maintain that cohesion, they were generally unstoppable. Epitomising this type of formation was the Roman legion, and the military power of a state was measured in the number of armoured infantrymen it could put into the field. Experienced heavy infantry were certainly able to hold their own against the light cavalry of their time. But the times were changing. The earliest known metal stirrups were developed in China between the 3rd and 5th centuries. The use of the new invention became increasingly commonplace. Gradually, this technology made its way westwards, and metal stirrups have been found in 7th and 8th century burial mounds in Eastern Europe. Charles Martel, Charlemagne's grandfather, may have taken advantage of iron stirrups to win the decisive Battle of Poitiers in 732, which brought to an end Muslim expansion into Europe. By the 11th century, stirrups were in common use. For example, they are displayed prominently on the Bayeux tapestry. In the depiction of the Battle of Hastings, armoured horsemen are shown routing the heavy infantry. By the 12th century, the mounted knight had become the dominant force on the battlefield. Yet this dominance went beyond the military sphere. In a seminal book, Medieval Technology and Social Change, published in the 1960s, Lynn White argued that the rise of the armoured horseman also had a profound effect on wider society. Rulers needed as many trained knights as they could find, and in order to maximise the potential of a given territory, the system of feudalism was invented. Land was divided into portions and granted to major lords, who subdivided this territory into smaller parcels, each one capable of supporting a knight. These they then granted to their own vassals. Military command took on a pyramid structure. From the king at the apex, protection and land grants flowed downwards. The different levels of vassals then reciprocated with their loyalty and service. This pyramid structure extended out into a wider society made up of laboradores, those who work, oratores, those who pray, and bellatores, those who fight. Binding the society together at all levels were personal oaths of fealty. an elegant formulation of history that seems to answer all the fundamental questions about how the classical world transformed into a very different medieval society. So when I noticed the stirrups on this picture, I felt duty-bound to speak up. After all, this was something being seen every day by impressionable young minds. School children might be led astray. Perhaps it was time to lodge a formal complaint. But luckily, before I could formulate such a complaint, something else occurred to me. A measure of skepticism is usually warranted, especially when it comes to things we ourselves assume to be true, which in turn led me to ask the most important question of all. Exactly what do I really know? First then, the basic premise. Is it really true that ancient horsemen had no knowledge of stirrups? Maybe, but maybe not. There's an obvious problem when claiming the non-existence of something. Often the argument relies on the absence of evidence, which soon leads to a fundamental error in logic. Namely, a lack of evidence for something is not in itself proof that the thing does not exist. To be considered valid, any historical hypothesis must be based on facts, usually archaeological discoveries, written testimonies of various types, or contemporary pictorial images. Each must be weighed in the balance and woven into an overall theory. So then, let's briefly consider the evidence available in each of these categories. Firstly then, archaeological evidence. In fact, the situation is well encapsulated by the original image from Coimbra. Arrayed in front of the portrait are the archaeological finds on which the depiction is based. Metal ornaments and buckles of various shapes and sizes. There is no sign of stirrups. As we have seen, the first example of metal stirrups were uncovered in China, and the earliest European finds are from the medieval period. Metal stirrups, that is. But it is also possible that ancient horsemen used leather straps and loops to fulfill a similar function, especially during training. Such an arrangement would have been perfectly adequate for the job, and yet would not have survived the thousands of years down to our own time. What then of contemporary witnesses? We have a number of ancient cavalry manuals, for example a treatise on horsemanship by the 4th century Athenian general Xenophon. Certainly these manuals make no mention of stirrups being used. On the other hand, this reticence is shared by authors even after stirrups are known to have reached Europe. Perhaps most telling though is that there are no expressions of surprise at first seeing them in action, no hint of warning about a dangerous new innovation. Overall then, the literate sections of society exhibited very little interest in stirrups, one way or another. Which leads us then to pictorial evidence. As we have already seen, Greeks, Romans and Etruscans all left us images of riders operating without stirrups, but does the absence of images of stirrups necessarily mean that stirrups were unknown? Or is this another more subtle form of arguing from an absence of evidence? Perhaps so. For all we know, there was a social stigma attached to the use of stirrups in these earlier periods. They might well have been seen as a sign of a less skilled horseman, one still in need of training aids. By and large, the images we have are monumental in nature, meant to portray perfect forms. The sculptors might have felt that stirrups detracted from this perfection. And so where does that leave us? Perhaps in Europe there was a less durable form of stirrup in use, a rope arrangement designed to be a training aid for novice riders. As such, they were seldom discussed or depicted in artwork, but when iron stirrups were first seen, their significance was not readily apparent. Only later, when heavier horses, saddles and armour were developed too, did the knight emerge to dominate both the battlefield and wider medieval society. And it's worth noting that, although the Chinese invented the stirrups centuries before they appeared in Europe, Chinese culture never really developed a European-style feudalism. Instead, they retained a centralised imperial system supported by a strong bureaucracy, which had more in common with the Roman government. When I looked at the image of the cavalryman in the museum for the first time, I was filled with a sanctimonious glee at catching such an obvious mistake. Now though, when I look at this same image, it's with questions rather than certainties, and that, I think, is the most important and perhaps the hardest lesson a historian has to learn. No theory, no matter how alluring or widely accepted, is above questioning. And this image taught me that.